Hola, minasan! Welcome back for another round of Warhammer 40k research. Another viewer recommended, very rare recommended. MK Starstorm 8822 recommended Arbitor Ian's real life biotransference, the multiple redesigns of the Necrons. MK Starstorm tried to help me find any type of sources for the regarding Matt Ward, like any interviews and such. Couldn't find many videos, but this one is the closest possible to get an idea of what happened with the redesigns and the direction Matt Ward went with. And we're gonna see precisely how it is that the Necrons ended up the way they did in terms of designs and how it became polarizing and so on. There's a bit of a history from Matt Ward apparently. We'll have to do a little bit more digging on that in the future, but for now we're gonna learn a little bit more from Arbitor Ian, precisely what happened with the Necrons. It's been a very fascinating arc here where you had a good design, and then suddenly you have a writer that decides to go into a whole different direction and produces polarizing results. We'll have to say. I think it's safe to say it's polarizing. You know, there's some who like the redesign. There's some who like the older design. From what I'm understanding, I'm sure I probably got it all wrong. In the comment section will be screaming their heads off at me. But the point is, that this is something that is very interesting to learn for writing, from a writing perspective and as a writer. So links to Arbitor Ian down in the description below as usual. Make sure you get your notes together for my post research review, and this call to action: comment, like, subscribe, follow, hit the notification button, and let us begin the research.
Hi gang, the Necrons are a major player in the Warhammer 40k universe, a terrifying threat slowly awakening on tomb worlds across the galaxy so they can bicker like old couples about legal disputes mostly. It's very fun. But the Necrons didn't start like that. They were a late addition to the 40k universe, and their lore and design went through a number of massive changes until they became the cranky old robots we know today. So, in this video, let's do a Necrospective and see how the Necrons evolved over 25 years of war.
Wow, 25 years.
So, Warhammer 40k has been around for ages. 37 years as I write this, and it's no secret that it's changed a fair bit as the universe has been fleshed out and expanded. Many of the factions we're used to today started out life as something else. Many of the pivotal events in the timeline were once mere throwaway notes, and the game as a whole has constantly changed to keep up with prevailing trends or to target new consumers. That's why it's managed to keep growing in popularity for so long. And within that framework, the Necrons are a really interesting faction to look at because they've changed a lot over the years. Not just little details or aesthetics, but in the core idea of what they are. Unlike most of the factions we're used to seeing in 40k, there's no mention of a Necron in the first edition of the game. No Necrons in Rogue Trader. They were introduced more than a decade later, and then basically rewritten 3 times until they finally found their place.
Wow.
Much more than with other factions, the story of the Necrons is one of Games Workshop shifting them and moulding them into whatever they thought the game needed at that particular time. It's a good story, but like everything in 40k, it actually starts somewhere completely different with something that isn't a Necron at all. This is the Chaos Android. Looks familiar, right? The Chaos Android was a unit from mostly Epic, released with the 2nd edition of the game in 1991. Chaos Androids were constructs of hardened plasteel created by the equally lost to time Chaos Squats, and within each one was bound a tiny malefic demon who really didn't like being in there. As such, they were malevolent entities that hated their existence, brought to life by warp-tainted science. They existed in the second edition of Epic, released in 1991, and there was a single metal model made at 40k scale, and they also made their way into that stalwart of teenage nerds in the early 90s, Space Crusade. That's certainly where I came across them first. But from the release of second edition 40k onwards, Chaos Androids and their pals, the Chaos Squats, kind of disappeared. Now, these aren't Necrons, but what they are is a pretty similar idea, because these are the first attempt in 40k to do space undead. Early 40k was a port from Warhammer Fantasy, and most fantasy factions were present. There were space orcs and space elves, space dwarves and chaos dwarves, and these guys are pretty obviously space undead. Skeletons of metal, often painted a suspiciously bony colour, animated by the 40k equivalent of evil magic. Hell, their bayonets even look a bit scythy, though that might just be the plastic bending. They're space undead, but with the...
Okay, so I get it. In those early editions of Warhammer 40k, they were just trying to do the equivalent of Warhammer Fantasy in terms of the fantasy races, but in this but a more sci-fi version of them. So the Necrons were supposed to be the equivalent of the undead in fantasy, in terms of fantasy lore and fantasy context. That would be their equivalent, the undead, but as a science fiction level. Okay, so that was basically where it started. The foundation. I guess those were the foundations of Warhammer, where they took the 40k, where they took the fantasy and made the sci-fi equivalent of the fantasy races. And so, because the Necrons represented the undead, I guess it would make sense that they would have some level of revision, because there's nothing interesting about the undead. You know, they're just zombies, basically. I could see that. I could see the impetus for the revision. So, what went wrong?
The advent of second edition 40k and the massive growth of the game as a whole, there was a general feeling that they needed to move a little further away from fantasy and space, and with their makers being slowly removed too, the Chaos Androids got Chaos Squatted. But the concept didn't stay dead for long. In January 1998, in White Dwarf 217, we got the first look at what will become a new faction. The actual, genuine first Necrons. The galaxy harbours its secrets. None know what races hide in the shadows, pursuing secret purposes of their own. Worlds are destroyed in raids that are easily and innocently ascribed to orcs or Eldar, but with worlds divided by the vastness of time and space, who is there to find the truth? Spacecraft are destroyed by silent, unseen foes, or lost on the tides of the warp, and none can say which. Who can measure the enemies of humanity, and who would willingly seek them out? In this article, the Necron Raiders are presented as a new threat for your games of 40k, a rare Xenos species, long thought dead, who occasionally descend on unwary backwaters, leaving none alive, and nobody knows why. And you can play them because they get a set of models. A box set of 5 Necron Raiders accompanied by 2 Scarabs were released, and White Dwarf 217 actually included a free metal Necron on the front. A lot of the lore introduced in this little article remains pretty current, though it's told entirely from the Imperium's perspective, through interrogations of survivors, after action reports and scholarly treatises.
Look at the...
Imperial historians had long known of dead races and knew of the ancient Necrontyr, lost to the galaxy for 60 million years because of the ruins of their tombs dotted across space. Though of course the Imperium never expected to see any of them active. Over the first half of 1998, even more Necron Raiders emerged. In the following issue, we were introduced to the Necron Lord with his Staff of Light, the first Necron Destroyer in its original form as a kind of jet bike thing, and a sample battle report as this glorious army of raiders fought the Sisters of Battle over Sanctuary 101. And a few months later, we get an article from the Mini's designer, Dave Andrews, on how he built this whole Necron pyramid complex.
Wow,
the model designs here are
that's
interesting.
big.
They're obviously still space skeletons, just like the old Chaos Androids, but this time the Chaos symbols have been replaced with pretty obvious ancient Egyptian influences. Their tombs are pyramids that lie under sands. They have scarab beetle robots and little blue and yellow Ankh-like detailing. And this is interesting because it was kind of ahead of its time in the 1990s. I originally suspected the influence of the best movie of the 90s, The Mummy, in this, but that didn't actually come out till a year later. In Warhammer Fantasy, the link between the undead Nagash and the old world's equivalent of ancient Egypt was established, but the actual split of the undead army into vampire-themed and mummy-themed wouldn't happen for another 5 years. Obviously, someone at Games Workshop was slightly ahead of the curve and had started down the path of Undead Are Egyptian in 1998, but there's another obvious 90s influence on these, and it's the Terminator movies.
Yeah.
The Necrons are described as super tough robot killing machines, and they have their signature repair ability actually called I'll Be Back.
I'll be back.
So look, this is an interesting new faction for 40k. Another go at Space Undead, obviously owing something to the previous design, but with a much more compelling backstory and a unique mix of design ideas, obviously taking inspiration from stuff they thought the nerds of the late 90s would find cool. Shame it didn't last longer really, because a few months later in October 1998, 3rd edition 40k was released, a complete reset, and all...
Honestly, I probably would have liked that. I probably would have been down with that. I was definitely enjoying like Stargate, The Mummy, Terminator. I really like those movies. I probably would have bought into that. Egyptian Terminators. Egyptian Terminators. If I had gotten into it, I definitely probably would have gone with the Necrons. But orcs all the way.
These rules crumbled back into the sands. The 3rd edition book had some get-you-by lists, but the new Necrons weren't included, so for a while they seem to have been just a fun little footnote in Warhammer history. Some more White Dwarf rules were published in February 1999, so you could then use the models from the previous year in your games, and the Necron Immortals were released at the same time to bolster a bit of interest. But the article says that this was mostly a test set of rules, maybe something that could be turned into a codex eventually, but you know, that was it for a while. Of course, they'd be back. 3rd edition 40k was a bit of a ground-up redesign. Not only were many of the weird offshoots of previous editions done away with, officially this time, but the designers also deliberately introduced whole new factions to try and appeal to new players and broaden the space of the game. Upon its release in 1998, Dark Eldar were introduced for the very first time, and 3 years later in 2001 we got the Tau, a wholly new concept of 40k, obviously designed to appeal to fans of Japanese mecha anime, which was starting to grow in popularity in the UK. The final addition to this wave of new factions would be our spooky friends, back from the dead with the release of the very first Codex Necrons for 3rd edition 40k in 2002. For this, the old metal models were replaced with a mixed plastic and metal range, with metal character models and the first big Necron vehicle in the form of the monolith, and the background for the army was expanded or changed depending on how you look at it. In this codex, we're given the story of the War in Heaven, a conflict millennia ago between the ancient but short-lived Necron tier and the Old Ones, who at this time were already like a vague presence in Eldar lore. The Necron tier allied with a species called the Catan, who hated the warp power of the Old Ones, gave them living metal bodies, and then fought a millennia-long war that eventually fractured the Old Ones' networks of power and defeated them, in the process being tricked into immortality by giving up their souls and encasing themselves in the same metal bodies they'd given to their gods. Eventually, the Necrons won, dominating the galaxy, but as the Catan fought amongst themselves and a great plague of enslavers was released from the warp, there just weren't enough souls left for the Catan to consume, so the remaining Catan came up with a plan to seal themselves away in tombs for millions of years, protected by their dormant robotic Necron warriors, until the galaxy had filled with life again and they had fresh souls to consume. What had started as isolated raids had now progressed into great wars as the legions of the Necrons awoke once more and marched out on the galaxy. So
that's getting from Arbiter Ian's explanation. So far, I'm trying to figure out what was wrong with the change. Then it seems more like an evolutionary change than so much as a disaster. It makes perfect sense since the Necrons were not firmly cemented permanently within a codex until third edition, and were just mostly a proof of concept game mechanisms for Warhammer on the outset. They were the product of just being a sci-fi counterpart of Warhammer Fantasy's Undead. Then they were given a test run, what appears to be a proof of concept test run in the second edition, during the second edition, and then it's in third edition because they wanted to bring in more people, more customers, that they became this modernized. So I'm very curious what went wrong. I'm sure he'll explain further.
Oh, space undead. Legions of mindless metallic skeletons, animated and controlled by their leaders, space vampires called Catan, who function in pretty much the same way as vampires do in an undead army. The individual Necrons had no self-determination or personality, and no interest in any other species, seeking only to destroy all life in the galaxy on behalf of their star god masters. And none of this actively contradicted the previous fluff. The whole design of the book presented this new stuff as information the Imperium were slowly discovering as the infrequent raids of second edition turned into the massed legions of third edition, or the scrying of the Eldar as they realized the ancient enemies returned. Cleverly done, and done with a very deliberate agenda. In an accompanying set of designer's notes in White Dwarf, the whole studio explained exactly what they wanted to do with this new range. Andy Chambers says how originally the intent back in 1998 had been to try out doing a small faction with a really deliberately limited set of miniatures, and the idea of expanding it had vaguely hung around in the background, but other things had proven more important until the release of the Tau, who were then a bit of a catalyst. In this article, Andy Chambers, Graham McNeil and Pete Haynes all talk about how the decision to bring back the Necrons and to change them the way they did was influenced by the Tau. The Tau had been introduced just a year before and were deliberately a bit of an oddity. Young, energetic, hopeful and full of sleek new technology. So while they were in the process of introducing new factions, what about doing the complete opposite? Contrasting this new, young, maneuverable, high-tech species with an ancient evil resurrected from the tombs, shaking off the dust of ages and returning to plague the galaxy with eldritch ancient technology. The Necrons and the Tau were opposites, introduced within a year of each other to broaden 40k's story and appeal, but unlike the Tau, with the Necrons the designers had a few threads they could weave in from previous books. The old ones had been vaguely present through the old 40k Slan faction in Warhammer Fantasy and in the Legends of the Eldar. The Catan were one of those random dangling plot threads that had been occasionally mentioned without anyone ever actually writing what they were. They were mentioned in second edition as a source of ancient Xenos technology, like the Calidus Assassin's Phase Blade, originally called the Catan Phase Sword. And of course, they had the Necron Raiders themselves, and all the stuff written just a few years before. Their design was cleaned up and made sleeker by Jez Goodwin in an attempt to make them feel more alien and less mechanical, you know, in the Imperial sense, and also probably to fit the constraints of plastic manufacturing back then. And their rules shifted from the super tough, super well-armoured elite groups of Terminators of the 90s into a shambling horde of skeletons who, while they could be put down, would just keep getting up again and again.
Okay, so basically the plan was, and it makes logical sense, it wasn't like a full-on retcon, but an incorporation to treat the Necrons as this as this mysterious race that would do raids, but nobody would have the evidence or anything. But there was rumors, legends, mythology, and lore running around especially amongst the humans, but they couldn't like fully confirm or cement it. Then by using the Tau as the as a plot point, to be able to serve as the opposition to, I guess, an opposition to the Necrons and their lore, to help, I guess, firmly establish what would be a rivalry, two rivalry groups. I believe that was their intent, and through the game sets, and White Dwarf, they would spoon feed the story of the Necrons, to flesh them out. Like, they didn't just throw it all into one big exposition dump, but every time they introduced something new in terms of the game, they would add to the lore and incorporate that. If that's what I'm understanding from Arbiter Ian, that is a pretty brilliant move, and a great way to be able to incorporate the older storylines of Necrons into the present day, and then tie them to Tau, so that they'd have like an opponent to deal with, like a legit opponent or something to contrast with in terms of aesthetics.
Was clever. A huge change to the Warhammer 40k universe, but presented as just an addition, an expansion, weaving together a number of previously random plot points and mentions, and any actual changes explained away as the Imperium just slowly learning more. But despite this great start, over the next few years, the Necrons kind of fell to the wayside. It felt, unfortunately, like an army with no personality. The model range was never huge, with no real room for personalisation other than painting them as different sorts of metal. And if the Catan were intended to be the big vampire count-like personalities of the army, that never really materialised. They were a legion of unrelenting, faceless drones in a game that already had that. They kind of stepped on the thematic toes of the Tyranids, a faction that were also an unrelenting mass of unindividuated drones who only want to consume all life.
Yeah,
and
it was
also
redundant.
Use the mechanic
That's what I had
of
pointed out
hordes
before,
of small things controlled by big powerful
two episodes
things.
ago.
And this was happening in an IP that, over the next decade, grew to be much more character-based. Black Library came into its own in the mid-2000s, and it's hard to write good characterful stories about either gods or personality-devoid robots. Insert Horus Heresy reference here. Their popularity waned, and their players were stuck with that 3rd edition codex and range through the entire 4th edition without anything in the way of an update. So, when the next update did come, 9 years later, the Necrons went through another big change. The 5th edition Necron Codex is packed with more lore than had pretty much ever been written about the Necrons. The starting point was the same, but it diverged pretty quickly. In this, the war in heaven, the discovery of the Catan, and the transformation of the Necrontyr into the metallic Necrons was all the same. But the metal robot bodies that everyone got wasn't the same. The Necrontyr were divided up into a number of dynasties under the overall rule of the Silent King Zarek, and how important you were in the dynasties determined how cool your robot body was. The peasants and serfs, workers and warriors
cool
became mindless automatons, but the priests and scientists, rulers and advisors received much better bodies that retained more of their personality, and they were aware that they had been deceived by the Catan. So, after the defeat of the Old Ones, Sarek led an uprising that turned on the Catan and broke them apart into shards locked away in deep vaults and only released under the direst of circumstances. Then, ashamed of his original decision and also realizing there was no life left in the galaxy, Sarek bid the dynasties to power down for thousands of years while he went out into the space between galaxies, searching for a way to reverse the biotransference.
Okay. Chat says Necrons even teamed up with the Empire to protect the galaxy against an orc and chaos invasion happening at the same time. Go orcs. I see the intent. I see the intent with the fifth edition change, because and I had pointed this out two videos ago, regarding the Necrons, that there was a sense of redundancy from what Snipe and Whip explained. I felt like there was a redundancy because the Tyranids, when they pointed out that they were mindless drones, but I recognized that the Tyranids was already a mindless hive mind type of drones. So I saw the redundancy going on between the two between those two factions, and it looks like it did come back. The redundancy did creep back up on the Necrons, and because the Tyranids already leaned very heavily with the hive mind and the way that they were designed, the Necrons had to be separated, set itself apart from the whole thing. And so it looked like the intent here with 5th edition was to establish named characters, sort of like how, like the Borg, with the Borg Queen, the identity factor. Let's call it the identity factor. You know, when you have a hive mind group with no identity or individual to identify as a point of reference to, it would have to be the only group in the whole thing. But then when you start introducing redundancies, something's got to give. I think I lost my whole entire train of thought on that one. Sorry about that. I think I lost my train of thought on that one. I think what I'm trying to say is that by giving the Necrons identity, I think I could see where the polarizing part comes in, because they were established to be, if I'm understanding this correctly, the mindless automatons. They're supposed to be mindless automatons. They're supposed to be Terminators, but because they were given personality, they were given agency, they were given a plot, that the Necrons, at 5th edition, was no longer the same. Didn't have that same. What made them what they are. They kind of lost the identity, the old identity. Like, the whole entire identity got replaced. That's what it looks like to be the case. However, I truly can understand where it's coming from, the intent, because you don't want two mindless factions, mechanics-wise, games, in terms of game mechanics, and it looks like that's what dictated the whole thing. The Tyranid game mechanics and the Necron game mechanics are almost near identical to each other. The hive-mindedness, so you have to separate the two apart. So by giving the Necrons identity and personality, they lost the original identity that was appealing to the fans of Necrons, if I'm understanding this correctly. Chat says, I like the Necrons a lot due to how the writers managed to make the zombie aspect be a horror experience to all other factions. Chaos fear the Necrons because they have no soul to feed upon. The Tyranids fear the Necrons because they have no biological parts to eat. And even the Orcs fear the Necrons because they are silent and joyless. It is a great touch of horror for all of them. Yeah. I could see that, actually. I could see that's where the lore meisters were going for. But I could also understand why some of the fans are not why there's a faction of fans that are not happy with the Necrons redesign, because they lost that unique luster to it. I could see that. Let's finish up.
And now, after thousands of years, the old dynasties were awakening, stuttering fitfully into unlife once again, and reigniting their ancient rivalries as Sarek approaches from the void between galaxies. So, pretty different, right? You could, again, pass this off in world by explaining that the Imperium has only just figured all this out. Maybe the ones with personalities just hadn't woken up yet. But yeah, this book doesn't really attempt to do that. It's just an outright change. The Necrons now had factions with different priorities, led by characters with distinct personalities and goals. The main character at the time was Imhotep the Stormlord of the Sautek dynasty, but this book also introduced Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner, Anrakir the Traveller and Nemesaur Zandrek. Actual named Necron characters for the first time. The range was also expanded. This is where we first saw Cryptex and the whole science so advanced it might as well be magic thing. We had Lichguard, Deathmarks, all the Necron vehicles, and lurking behind this all, the reawakening Triarch Praetorians preparing the road for the return of the Silent King. The Necrons not only now had a personality, but also distinct reasons to be fighting with each other, which is always useful in Warhammer. And like lots of things in this hobby, a certain group of people really didn't like it. Yeah. We were sold faceless legions of skeletons. Where are the rest of my Catan? I don't want sub-factions. Why do we have to be like everyone else? The moaning online went on for a while and then eventually died down because the third iteration of Necrons was obviously way better as a faction in a war game. And since then, Necrons have kind of remained the same. New units have been revealed with each update, which is great, but now they have some agency and drama to them. Necrons have become much more important to the overall plot of 40k. Novels have featured Necron characters, some proving so funny and popular that they were written into more and more of the plot. Everybody loved Rob Rath's portrayal of Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner in The Infinite and the Divine, and so those characters started turning up more in the Fall of Cadia or in the Fabius Bile novels. After the Great Rift, we have the return of the Silent King and the construction of the Pariah Nexus. The Necrons now feel like a major player in the 40k universe, which is amazing for a faction that were only introduced over a decade into the game as a mini test faction. It took 3 attempts to get the Necrons to this point, to change them again and again into what they needed to be. 4 if you want to include the Chaos Androids and the general idea of making space undead work. That development process was influenced by past things in the 40k lore, but also outside influences in popular culture. In the late 90s, the Terminator movies were iconic, so let's put them in 40k. In the early 2000s, anime was a hot new thing, so what would be a good counterpart to our hot new anime faction? Our publishing arm has taken off and we've written ourselves into a corner with a faction with no personality. Great, change them so we can write some books about them. Necrons are a great example of how a franchise has to change to keep up with the times, and how 40k folds in current trends in an attempt to stay relevant. Without doing that, it's likely that the Necrons would have been discontinued, one of those factions that just got lost by the wayside, a footnote from some 90s White Dwarfs that no one remembers. The same applies to the whole game, really. Nothing lasts forever, not even space skeletons. But by changing to fit the mood of the times, we might get a few more dusty millennia yet. Thanks for watching.
I actually understand why Warhammer made the changes that they did. I'm not sure precisely what Matt Ward, since he's the one that a few videos, the previous video focused on very heavily, had done to the Necrons and also the whole of Warhammer. I still would like to at least get his perspective, but I totally could see why Games Workshop and the lore masters went in that direction with the Necrons. It makes perfect sense because with the Tyranids being a hive mind and mindless hive mind like creatures, and then you have a similar account with the similar design with the Necrons being, you know, a mindless robotic automatons. You got redundancy. You got redundancy of 2 factions being of similar nature, and one of them's got to adapt. And the Tyranids was definitely leaned in hard with the hive-minded thing. With the whole hive mind bug mechanic. So it makes sense that the Necrons being skeletal robots, you know, with souls trapped in them, that they would be the ones to go through the revision and adjustments. I don't know, and I get where the fans are coming from because when it comes to changes, and you're so accustomed and familiar with what you have experienced for a long time, that to see the changes can be off-putting. This happens in comic books. It happens to a lot of long-running shows and series. The Simpsons is a good example. I could give you a good example. The Simpsons. Everybody talks about how great the first 9 years, the first 9 seasons were, and then after that, with all the changes that's happening, that happens, people get put off by it. There was a recent episode of The Simpsons. I don't know if it was this season or the previous season, where they had to retcon once again Marge and Homer's origin. When they did Homer's origin in the 90s, they were in the 60s, if I recall correctly. They were teenagers in the 60s. Let's see, like roughly around the 60s or 70s, and they had the kids in the 80s. And then the kids end up growing, becoming 10-year-olds in the 90s. Then like around the 2000s or 2010s, if I remember correctly, they had to get retconned again. This time they moved Marge and Homer's life into the 90s, which is when they had the kids. And now they did another retcon. They did another shift of Marge and Homer and pushed them into the 2010s, or the 2000s, early 2000s. I'm not sure if like the early 2000s. So they're always pushing Homer and Marge, and as a result, they're always changing up the stories, and the fans are always. There's always that one faction of fans who's like, I can't stand the change. I don't like the change. They're ruining everything. And that's what the case is here, apparently. And it looks like Matt Ward may be getting the brunt of the blame for the changes. He seems to have a very low reputation. The reputation where people are least likely to speak good of from these small factions. But I get where the redesigns are coming from, because they were Necrons were just like a test subject, a test run to see how they would operate within the context of science fiction, since they were supposed to be the sci-fi counterpart of the undead, and their first revision made them into Terminators, mindless Terminators for the most part. And so the 5th edition is when they started getting more personalities, character names and such. And as I had pointed out, it could be a good thing or a bad thing. The Borg, a lot of people were not happy with the way that the Borg in Star Trek got changed. They weren't so much mindless automatons. They were mind-linked and reprogrammed living beings that were given robotic parts, and their minds were completely blocked off. Their free will was completely locked out, and they were given programming to add more people into the collective. And the second First Contact introduced the Borg Queen and gave it an identity and an identity marker. People were very critical of it. Me, I didn't really care. Personally, I didn't care about it, but people were very critical of that, because it stripped away what made the Borg unique and menacing and threatening by giving it an identity, something to identify with. But from what I understood, that was the result of studio executives who couldn't grasp the idea of the Borg not having a specific identifier to work with, but it still was okay. but ultimately it led the writers down the line to introduce Seven of Nine and explore more. But to be honest, to be honest here, we did get Hugh, and Hugh was in the series. Hugh was introduced in the series, and it was the first time we got to really see more of the Borg and the lore. And not only that, but Hugh was able to not only break himself away from the Borg, but was able to rally a faction of Borg who were severed, who got severed from the collective. And so, like, the whole identifier thing. So, like, the criticism of the Borg Queen might be a fair opinion, maybe a fair, valid opinion, because that should have, like, Hugh, I guess, in a way, by introducing the Borg Queen, kind of undermines Hugh in that regards, because Hugh was a different type of identifier in that he created a resistance movement of free Borg, well, free beings, humanoids, who were kidnapped and transformed against their will and everything, and giving the Borg Queen itself, and still kept the how you say, it still kept the Borg menacing, because we didn't have the Borg Queen yet. And then once the Borg Queen happened, it changed the dynamic of the Borg itself, rather than letting Hugh change the dynamics of the Borg through by way of Locutus, Captain Picard, showing that it is possible to sever from the link and be able to have your individuality and identity by giving the Borg Queen. Establishing the Borg Queen having individuality within the collective itself undermines the concept of the collective itself. There we go. So it didn't exactly help much with Borg's lore. To contrast, where Games Workshop and their writers were going with, they were feeding the piecemeal the development of the Necrons until they ultimately just went all in and give personalities, factions, also known as dynasties, and individualism like Trazyn, and while the rest are all mindless Borg-like creatures. I think it's perfectly fine. Honestly, I think it was fine. If there was an overdone fair criticism, what I'm saying, sometimes you could overdo it. Again, Borg Queen wasn't overdone and caused what was supposed to be a scary collective that is stripped of individuality. You have a contradiction in the Borg Queen, who's individual. Here, with the Necrons, I would like to find out what precisely it is that I mean, I know, already Ian pointed out, but it was kind of more like a footnote. I would like a more specific aspect of what it was in the change that kind of made a small subset of Warhammer fans to completely criticize the whole thing, the whole redesign, and specifically targeting Matt Ward for those changes. For me personally, I don't think it's that big a deal. You don't want to have redundant creatures, two creatures of the same thing. You want to have everyone set itself apart, and so on, and being able to evolve the characters. At some point, the Necrons would have to have advance itself. You can't keep them stagnant forever, in a sense, and you want people to be able to have fun and so on. be able to have fun. You want to be able to draw people into your factions. If they see that there's if they see that if new fans were to have seen that the Necrons and the Tyranids were of similar design in terms of hive mind, mindless automaton type of thing, they would probably go for the path of least resistance. Let me put it like this. From a sell point perspective, if you have a card game based on Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2, the card game, and you have a game, a fighting game that's just an original concept fighting game. Let's say it's called Punchy the fighting game, okay, and you present it to the company that's publishing Street Fighter 2, the card game. The company's gonna sit there and they're gonna tell you, yes, we could publish the game, and we'll put your Punchy the fighting game next to Street Fighter 2, but our customers are going to look at Street Fighter 2 and will pick up Street Fighter 2 because we'll choose Street Fighter 2 because they're familiar with the game Street Fighter 2. They're not familiar with Punchy the fighting game. That's the case with Necrons and Tyranids. If the Tyranids prove to be the better of the two, then everybody's just going to go straight to the Tyranids, and the Necrons will not make the profit, will not be proven to be the popular character, because they're both similar minded, and the Tyranids would have the better output in terms of combat, gaming, and everything. So it makes sense to make the Necrons as different as and independent as possible from being seen as redundant and be held up. The same could have happened to the Tyranids as well. Well, no, because the Tyranids was before the Necrons, if I understand correctly. Because Necrons came out 10 years after the release, and if I understand correctly, the Tyranids was one of the originals. Correct me if I'm wrong. So if people would have saw the Necrons and saw the more established Tyranids, people would have gone with the more established Tyranids that was more fully fleshed out than the Necrons that was similar in design to the Tyranids. The Necrons would have definitely died out. But by giving them personalities, some of the most crazy stuff, like Trazyn. Trazyn's personality is hilarious. Like, it's pretty hilarious, and all this deep lore that they fed in, definitely helped the Necrons a lot in terms of becoming popular, being able to sustain themselves within the Warhammer universe, having their opposing, having like rival, I guess, with the Tau. From what I'm understanding, chat says, as for me, I just go as far as the story pleases me and ignore everything else. Yeah, you see, there we go. But overall, I see with the situation now. If it was like too much at once, like information overload or lore overload, story overload, overload. I can't pronounce that correctly. I'm saying overlord, overload. Like too much at once being thrusted onto everybody that they not having enough time to process. I could see the backlash. I could see the resistance from customers and fans alike, pushing back at it. Because you're putting in too much at once, you're moving too fast, and you're not giving people time to process and acclimate to the new changes. Now, if that's what the case is, then you will have people who'll be like, I hate the changes and everything, because it was just thrusted on too fast. Be very careful when doing that. If you're gonna make a fundamental change and a dynamic change, to your characters. Make sure that it's that it eases in nice, that it's moved in nice and easy. Like Arbitor Ian had pointed out, in the during the second edition and that whole course, they were slowly incorporating things. They weren't just rushing things into the Necrons. They were incorporating them very easily into the universe and making it easy for people to comprehend and grasp who the Necrons are. Apparently, with the 5th edition, they just threw everything in there from what it sounds like, and the fans just felt the information overload. Now they see 10 dynasties and 20 named characters and different factions, and their brains are probably like, whoa, this is too much to process. If that was the case, then yeah, be very careful when doing that in your storytellings and such, that you don't create information overload on your readers, your audience, or even gamers as well. So yeah. I'm still interested though in that Matt Ward, and what happened and why he's the one that got singled out by Wes Hammer specifically, and see what it is that he had, what it was that he done with the Necrons that got that small group. But it's good to know, according to Arbiter Ian, that it's subsided and people are now okay with the Necrons as is. But I definitely would like to fully understand from as a writer, why it is that Snipe and Wib and Wes Hammer channels, both channels had pointed this little facet out. So yeah, there we go. So head on over to Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and grab yourself a copy of The Impossible Man, a strange fantasy novel written by me. You'll find links to the book in the description down below, along with links to other merch such as pins, stickers, t-shirts, music. Enjoy the products. Thank you for your patronage. And if you have a copy of The Impossible Man novel and did a YouTube video on it, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. And if you're interested, you could join me on my live multi-stream on Twitch at Kick every Monday through Thursday, 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am slurring my speech. I'm not drunk. We could catch lore research, Japanese cultural studies, gaming, and more. I look forward to hanging out with you. So until the next round of Warhammer research, thank you all for joining me, and I wish you all a good night. Buenas noches, and oyasumi nasai.